A black businessman boards his first-class flight like he has 100 times before, quiet, composed, focused. But today, everything changes. A flight attendant sees his skin before his status and decides he doesn't belong. What starts as a side-eye turns into a public confrontation. What she doesn't know: he's the man behind a $700 million acquisition and the airline she works for as part of the deal. Just 12 hours later, she's out of a job and the whole company is in crisis. What happened next had the entire plane, no, the entire internet, talking. Stay with me. This is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if this story hits home, hit like and subscribe for more. Because this started like any other flight and ended with history. They say that power wears a uniform, but too often it wears a smirk. The kind of smirk that doesn't need to shout because it has the weight of history on its side. On a Tuesday morning heavy with the drone of jet engines and commuter fatigue, Charles Emmanuel Wright stepped into Gate 4A at JFK, a man carved from quiet steel. His suit, navy, pressed, whispered elegance, not opulence. He walked with the precision of a man who'd seen too much to explain himself, and not enough to forget. Behind the desk stood Brenda Coyle. Mid-40s, immaculately presentable, taut smile practiced like a hymn. Her fingers hovered over the scanner as Charles approached. Without a glance at his ticket, she motioned toward the economy queue. "Sir," she said, soft and clipped, "you're in the wrong line." Charles didn't argue. He didn't flinch. Instead, he extended his boarding pass with steady fingers. "First class," he said simply. Brenda's eyes flicked to the screen. 1A, her expression tightened, like a knot being pulled. "One moment," she muttered, stepping away to whisper with a colleague. The whispering, the side glances, the not-so-subtle skepticism, it was a ritual he knew too well. It happened in hotel lobbies, in executive lounges, even in the boardrooms of companies he owned. A few minutes later, she returned with all the warmth of a thawed ice cube. "You may proceed," she said. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just permission, as if access was a gift she had every right to grant or withhold. Charles entered the cabin, the muted jazz and citrus-polished leather greeting him like a club that never meant to open its doors to him. The flight attendant who greeted the white couple ahead of him with "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Denham," offered him nothing but a brief, stiff nod. No name. No welcome. He took his seat, 1A, placing his leather case beneath the seat with a precision that mirrored his restraint. Across the aisle, a man in a salmon shirt with a golf tan whispered to his wife, "Can you believe it?" The wife didn't respond, but her expression did. Moments later, Brenda Coyle appeared again, walking the aisle like a warden inspecting cells. She stopped at Charles's seat, posture militant. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" Her tone had shifted, still polite, but laced with warning. Charles handed it over without a word. Brenda looked once, then again. "System inconsistencies," she said. "We've had a hectic morning." He nodded. "I wouldn't want anyone sitting in the wrong section." Her mouth twitched, but she said nothing more. Charles sat back, knowing full well this was only the first inning of the game they'd play. The one where you're tested not for what you do, but for who they decide you are. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But the ledger in his mind had opened, and names were being written in ink. The flight hadn't left the tarmac, but the air in first class was already thinner. Not from altitude, but from something heavier than gravity, the quiet judgment of those who wore comfort like armor and suspicion like scent. Charles Emmanuel Wright, seated in 1A, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with a slow deliberation. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to breathe. The woman in 1B, blonde, mid-30s, smelling of money and lavender oil, turned her shoulders sharply, as if proximity to Charles required a layer of insulation. She pulled out hand sanitizer with the flair of a ritual, rubbed it into her palms, then reached for her designer shawl and clutched it tightly around her like a barrier. It would have been easy for Charles to dismiss the gesture, to pretend it was nothing more than the paranoia of modern travel. But he had lived too long and seen too much. This wasn't about germs. This was about space. Ownership of it. Control of it. The theater of discomfort dressed as civility. The flight attendant reappeared, blonde and brittle in her smile, handing out glasses of champagne. She served the couple in 1C and 1D with a flourish and a warm, "Enjoy the flight." When she got to Charles, her tray dipped slightly, her voice flattened. She didn't ask. She didn't offer. She merely stared. "Something to drink?" "I'll have what they're having," Charles replied, his tone neither warm nor confrontational. "Just a present." She poured a half glass, set it down like a verdict, and moved on. Moments later, Brenda Coyle returned. Again. Clipboard now in hand, she bent slightly toward Charles. "We're just double-checking seat assignments. You understand." He looked up. "You checked once. Then again. Do you need a third opinion?" She paused, caught in the snare of her own protocol. It's standard procedure when inconsistencies appear. Is there an inconsistency in seat 1B? Or just mine? Her eyes blinked quickly, as if searching for a response tucked behind her own doubt. "No, sir. You're correct. It's just a precaution." He nodded slowly, the kind that only applies to certain passengers. She said nothing more, just moved on, leaving behind the rustle of unspoken questions. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy jacket and Princeton tie lowered his newspaper, giving Charles a once-over that lingered too long. His gaze didn't hold curiosity. It held catalogs, as if he were trying to place Charles in a box that refused to shut. Then came the whisper. From 1B, the blonde woman murmured, not quietly enough, "I didn't know they gave upgrades for diversity." Charles didn't turn his head. He didn't flinch. He just sipped the champagne, flat and warm, and let the silence say what his words would only sharpen. The flight crew busied themselves. The engines hummed louder. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, but the mood had curdled. You could feel it. The tension wasn't overt. It never was. It was in the way people cleared their throats too often, adjusted their belts, looked anywhere but directly at him. The stewardess passed again, this time pausing just long enough to accidentally bump Charles's arm with the edge of her cart. No apology followed, only the soft squeak of wheels moving on. And yet, through it all, Charles remained composed. Not out of passivity, but because he understood something they didn't. Dignity is not a performance. It is a resistance. And he had long since learned that when the world tries to define you by discomfort, you answer not with outrage, but with presence. He opened his briefcase, pulled out his tablet, and began reviewing notes for the meeting awaiting him on the West Coast. An acquisition worth $700 million. He wasn't flying to ask permission. He was flying to take ownership. And yet, the people around him saw only the seat he occupied, not the weight he carried into it. Above them, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and distant. Flight time is approximately 6 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey. But Charles knew this was no journey of comfort. This was a proving ground. And the proving had only just begun. At 30,000 feet, the world below blurs into abstraction, mountains, cities, and boundaries reduced to quiet lines. But in seat 1A, nothing blurred. Everything sharpened. Every glance, every whisper, every deliberate omission etched itself into the fabric of Charles Emmanuel Wright's patience. The first meal service began with all the ceremonies the airline could muster. Linen napkins. Stainless cutlery. A choice between seared salmon or grilled filet. The blonde woman in 1B ordered confidently, as if her words were commands rather than requests. When the attendant reached Charles, she didn't ask for his preference. She asked for confirmation. "Chicken, right?" He looked up from his notes. "No. I'll have the filet." "A beet." Then a hesitant nod. She marked something on her pad and moved on. But the assumption had already landed. It wasn't new. It was just familiar, an echo of all the times his decisions had been made for him before he'd spoken, all the rooms where he was addressed last, but watched first. Every cut of steak or suit did not matter when the skin wearing it still wrote the script before his mouth could. As the meal arrived, Charles noticed his tray lacked a side dish present on every other plate. No asparagus. No apology. The woman in 1B noticed too. She didn't say anything to the attendant. She just smiled to herself and continued eating. It was the smile that spoke the loudest. He didn't ask for corrections. Instead, he made a note of it, not just on the pad beside his tablet, but in the quiet ledger he'd been keeping long before boarding. Across the aisle, the Princeton man from earlier shifted in his seat and leaned forward to speak with a colleague. "They've really lowered the bar for first class these days," he muttered. "Feels like a marketing stunt." His companion chuckled without committing. But neither looked at Charles. That was the key to their strategy, exclusion by implication. Charles dabbed the corner of his mouth with a cloth napkin and turned his attention back to his tablet. He didn't need their validation. He needed their silence, which they were no longer offering. A soft chime indicated the seatbelt sign was back on. Mild turbulence rocked the plane, not enough to alarm, but just enough to unnerve those who had mistaken altitude for safety. The blonde woman gripped the armrest, then turned to Charles, her tone clipped. "Just so you know, if this gets worse, I don't do well in emergencies." Charles glanced at her, his voice smooth as water over glass. "I imagine you expect me to do well for the both of us then." Her face flushed, not with fear, but with recognition. He had seen through her veneer. The turbulence passed. The captain's voice returned, calm and practiced. But the real shaking had already occurred, in the dynamics between row 1A and everything around it. After dinner, the cabin lights dimmed. The air settled, but the tension remained, like the hum of an old machine that never powers down. Charles reclined slightly, though rest was the last thing on his mind. His thoughts returned to the boardroom he was headed toward, a table where no one would question his seat, not aloud. But where the echoes of this flight would follow him, as they always did. An attendant approached again. A different one, young, brunette, unsure. "Sir," she began softly, "I just wanted to check. Do you need anything else this evening?" Her voice was different. Not forced. Not condescending. It was nervous, yes, but there was something real in it. She had seen something the others hadn't. Or perhaps she had simply chosen to. Charles gave a polite nod. "No, thank you." She hesitated, then said, I saw what happened earlier. "I'm sorry." Charles met her eyes. "Don't be sorry for me," he said gently. "Be sorry for the silence." She blinked, nodded, and moved away. Back in his seat, Charles allowed himself a breath. Not of relief, but of clarity. The altitude hadn't changed him. The air hadn't poisoned him. But it had revealed, once again, how thin the line was between civility and contempt. And how often it was the quiet ones who carried the storm. The night sky outside the window of seat 1A had turned ink black, a mirror to the mood inside the cabin. Charles Emmanuel Wright stared out into the void, not to escape the discomfort around him, but to remind himself of what space looked like when it didn't belong to anyone. Up here, above the world, land had no fences, and people had no masks. But in this cabin, luxuriously lit and perfumed with quiet power, the lines were drawn sharp and the masks worn tighter. It started with a laugh. A man in 1D, ruddy complexion, silver hair slicked back with an arrogance that reeked of inherited confidence, leaned toward the man beside him and said, not quite under his breath, "You notice how everyone's got a cause these days? First it was the environment. Now it's all about making sure every boardroom got a face like his in it." He didn't gesture. He didn't need to. The man beside him chuckled. A dry, mirthless sound. "Diversity," he said, dragging the syllables like something bitter in his mouth. It's not about merit anymore. It's about optics. The words hovered in the air, too bold to be accidental, too cowardly to be confrontational. But they didn't go unnoticed. Charles turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the gaze of a younger man a few rows back, a quiet onlooker who had been watching everything with the wide, stunned eyes of someone slowly learning how the world truly works. The young man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and Charles returned it. Because sometimes a nod is all a man needs to know he is not alone. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant, Veronica Hughes, returned to Charles's row. Her voice was ice-wrapped in velvet. "Sir, I need to ask you again to keep your personal items completely under the seat in front of you. FAA regulations." Charles looked down at his briefcase, tucked precisely where it belonged, and then back at her. "It hasn't moved," he said calmly. "Nor has the regulation." She pursed her lips. "I'm just doing my job." "So am I," Charles said, holding her gaze. "Yours is safe. Mine is dignity." The sentence didn't raise his voice. It raised the room's temperature. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. But her silence said more than an argument could. By now, the atmosphere in first class had become an unspoken referendum on who gets to belong. The rules hadn't changed, but how they were enforced had. The glances lasted longer. The service came slower. And the conversations, once benign, turned sharp with insinuation. The blonde woman in 1B, perhaps emboldened by the whispers around her, called over the attendant and asked with exaggerated concern, "Is he allowed to use his device the whole flight?" "I thought that wasn't safe." The attendant assured her it was fine, but the question had already done its work. It wasn't about safety. It was about surveillance. Her voice had carried far enough for nearby passengers to hear. Now, eyes were turning again, not in curiosity, but in calculation. Charles closed his tablet. Not because he was wrong, but because he was tired of being right in a room that wouldn't admit it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a folded photo. Faded with time. A black and white image of his father, seated at a lunch counter in Alabama, a line of white protesters sneering behind him. It wasn't nostalgia. It was an inheritance. The burden of memory handed down like a baton in a race with no finish line. Back in the cabin, Veronica approached once more, this time with a smile that had the exact weight of a blade. "Would you like to move seats, sir?" she asked. "Some of the other passengers are feeling tense." It was phrased like an offer, but it sounded like an eviction. Charles looked around, slowly, at the faces turned away, at the silence that nodded in complicity. Then he turned back to her. "I'm not the reason they're tense," he said. "I'm the mirror." She flinched, barely, but enough. "I'll stay where I am." And with that, he turned back to the window, to the vast dark sky that didn't ask him to move, didn't need him to explain, didn't shrink from his presence. Outside, stars hung still. Inside, the cabin fidgeted in discomfort. The curtain between first class and coach rustled slightly as a flight attendant passed through. A small boy peeked through behind her, eyes wide, catching a glimpse of Charles. The boy smiled. Charles smiled back. And for the first time on that flight, something real cracked through the performance of hierarchy. Not loud, not grand. Just a quiet moment of human recognition, pure, unsuspicious, unpoliced. Because sometimes revolution doesn't come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from staying seated and refusing to disappear. The descent into discomfort had not ended with takeoff. In fact, the higher the plane climbed, the more the walls of civility began to close in around Charles Emmanuel Wright like a polite noose. At 30,000 feet, the illusion of equality began to suffocate. And the most dangerous part of it all was how it wore a smile. After the second in light meal was served, Charles noticed a pattern, subtle but consistent. Every interaction from the crew came with a temperature just a few degrees cooler than what he witnessed around him. The white couple across the aisle received warm towels, folded like origami. Charles got one hastily tossed beside his cup, damp and lukewarm. The older woman in 2D received a refill before she even asked. Charles had to request his twice. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. But for the man who had been navigating these waters since segregation dressed up in new names, urban renewal, culture fit, professionalism, it was everything. At some point during the flight, a turbulence warning flashed overhead. Nothing major. A light chop. But the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom with urgent precision. Cabin crew, prepare for intermittent turbulence. Remain seated with seatbelts fastened. The flight attendants rushed into action, securing trays, halting service. Veronica, ever the vigilant gatekeeper of decorum, passed by Charles's row, pausing once again with that particular brand of concern that was anything but. Please ensure all your belongings are secure, she said. That includes anything you might be using. Charles raised an eyebrow. I believe the turbulence is outside the window, not in the seat. She forced a smile. Just being thorough, sir. The woman in 1B leaned toward her and whispered something. Veronica nodded. Then, without warning, she knelt down beside Charles's row and began adjusting the briefcase under his seat. Excuse me, Charles said, his voice steady but cold. That's personal property. She didn't stop. FAA compliance, sir. I've flown enough miles to know when safety is the excuse and when it's the justification, he said. Passengers nearby began to look. Not with curiosity, but with that instinctive twitch of people sensing a scene they'd prefer to ignore, but can't quite turn away from. And that's when it happened. The turbulence struck, not from the sky, but from the aisle. As Veronica stood, the cart jolted slightly, its corner clipping Charles's leg. Not hard enough to injure, but just enough to sting. She gasped, feigning shock as though gravity had conspired with her to execute the blow. Oh! My apologies, she said. But there was no apology in her eyes. Charles steadied himself, said nothing. Because at that moment, silence was the only protest that couldn't be misquoted. A younger attendant, one who had remained in the background until now, approached hesitantly with a towel. She extended it toward Charles without a word, but her face, mixed with shame and sympathy, spoke volumes. He accepted the towel but never broke eye contact with Veronica. You might want to check your car's alignment, he said. Her lip twitched. Sir, if there's a problem. There's always a problem, Charles interrupted. But the question is never if. The question is who notices. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, then closed again. She stepped back. It was then that Charles realized what this flight had become. It wasn't just a trip across the country. It was a stage. And everyone on board was performing either complicity, discomfort, or the slow unwinding of their own conscience. The woman across from him, who had earlier laughed at a veiled remark about diversity hires, now refused to meet his gaze. The man beside her had gone silent, clutching his tablet like a shield. Even the child from earlier had grown restless, fidgeting against his seatbelt, sensing the dissonance in the air though he didn't yet have the words for it. And that's when the final twist came. A voice on the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received confirmation that a special executive passenger on board today will be greeted by a team upon landing for an expedited escort. A brief pause. We kindly ask that you remain seated to allow this individual to deplane first. A few murmurs. Then, almost immediately, Veronica reappeared, face pale. She was holding a printed passenger manifest, one now bearing a highlighted name. Charles Emmanuel Wright. Mr. Wright, she said, her voice a whisper now. I didn't realize. You never do, he replied. That's the root of it. And then he leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let the weight of the cabin fall where it would. The plane continued westward, but the reckoning had already landed. By the time the wheels touched the ground in Los Angeles, the temperature in first class had dropped several degrees, not from the air, but from the silence. That deep, brittle silence that falls after something irreparable has cracked but hasn't yet shattered. Charles Emmanuel Wright remained seated as instructed, but it wasn't the kind of stillness born of obedience. It was the stillness of a man who knew the rules were never made for him, but had learned how to maneuver through them with the grace of someone who refused to be broken by them. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin doors, no one around him spoke. The woman in 1B stared straight ahead, her posture tight with regret masquerading as discomfort. The man in the salmon shirt, who'd once chuckled at Charles under his breath, now fiddled with his watch like a boy caught cheating in church. Everyone had heard the announcement. Everyone knew. But knowing the truth isn't the same as understanding it. Veronica returned once more. Her crisp uniform now looked like a costume, one that no longer fit. She stood a step away from Charles, her hands folded like a student caught out of line. "Mr. Wright," she began. Charles didn't look up. "I trust the stairs will be ready." "They are," she said quickly. "There's an escort waiting just beyond the gate. They'll guide you to the terminal lounge." She hesitated, then added, "I hope your stay in Los Angeles is comfortable." This time, Charles turned. His gaze was calm, measured, but behind it stood the weight of generations. "Comfort," he said slowly, "is not something I ask for. Not anymore. I ask for fairness. And when I stop asking, I start owning." Veronica swallowed hard. "Understood," she whispered. But it wasn't clear if she did. The door opened with a hiss, and the cabin filled with light that felt harsher than it should. A tall black man in a tailored black suit waited at the jet bridge, flanked by two younger staffers. They stood straighter when they saw Charles. Not because he demanded it, but because they recognized it. Dignity in motion commands presence. He stood slowly, his briefcase in hand, and as he walked past the rows of plush seats and a sea of quiet white faces, he wasn't just exiting a plane. He was walking out of the small, stifling theater where racism had played out once again, cloaked not in slurs or violence, but in the slow drip of microaggressions, the smirk that punctuates superiority, the misunderstanding that always bends in one direction. At the terminal entrance, a woman with gray-streaked hair and the air of quiet power approached him. Her badge read, C.L. Matthews, VP Client Relations. She extended her hand. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice professional, but not robotic. "We've been informed of the incident on board. I want to personally offer our apologies, though I know words are cheap, and history makes them cheaper still." Charles raised an eyebrow. That kind of honesty wasn't common. She continued, "Your presence with us today is not only valued, it's a mirror held up to what we still fail to confront." He studied her for a beat, then shook her hand. "Acknowledgement is the first step," he said. "But steps don't mean much if we just keep circling the same place." She nodded slowly. "We're trying to change that." Charles exhaled, the kind of breath that carries decades. "Then change needs teeth," he said. "Not just tone." The escort led him down a private corridor toward a luxury car waiting to take him to the conference center. But Charles wasn't done with the day, not by a long shot. The acquisition meeting loomed, and with it came the real reckoning. What those passengers on the plane hadn't realized was this: the man they'd tried to reduce with glances and silence was about to finalize a deal that would rewire their industry from the top down. And when systems get rewired, people can't hide behind routine anymore. As the car pulled away from the airport curb, Charles looked out at the city and its layered contradictions: sunlight on glass towers, tents under overpasses. The American dream, still gated, still guarded. But the gates rust. Locks break. And people like Charles, men who refuse to vanish quietly, are the hammer. The boardroom at Belridge West Tower rose like a cathedral to capitalism: glass walls, brushed chrome, and a long polished table where power sat comfortably in Italian suits. The kind of place where people spoke in numbers and smiled in silence, where race was never mentioned but always measured. Charles Emmanuel Wright entered not as a guest, but as gravity. And the room adjusted. He didn't wait for introductions. He didn't need to. His name was already printed on the acquisition paperwork, his signature stamped in dry ink across pages worth more than half the companies represented at the table. But still, the room tested him, as it always did. A white man across the table, Gerald Harrow, CFO of the target firm, cleared his throat and leaned back with a performative casualness. "Mr. Wright," he said, voice smooth with patronizing charm, "before we begin, I just want to say how refreshing it is to see diversity taking such a visible leadership role in this kind of transaction." The room chuckled lightly, the kind of chuckle that tries to pass itself off as collegial. Charles didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly and gave a half-smile. "Is that your way of asking if I'm qualified?" he asked quietly. The words landed like ice water. Gerald's smile froze. "No, of course not. I just meant—" "I know what you meant," Charles interrupted. "You meant I'm a surprise. You meant I'm not the man you pictured when you saw the name on the letterhead." Silence. Not defensive, just exposed. Charles tapped the manila folder in front of him. "Let me surprise you again," he said. "This deal isn't a handout. It's leverage. We're not acquiring your company for optics. We're absorbing it because your logistics chain is a decade behind, your leadership is a silo, and your public goodwill is bleeding out." He paused. "But don't worry. I'll still give you a seat at the table. I just won't pretend you earned it with anything other than longevity." The room shifted. Postures straightened. Laptops opened. The performance of disbelief gave way to the gravity of truth. And still, beneath it all, that quiet racial undercurrent hummed, never spoken, always felt. The black man in the room wasn't just capable. He was in command. And for some, that was the real crisis. After the first round of numbers, Gerald tried again, this time hiding behind data. "Our metrics," he said, gesturing to a chart, "suggest that market trust might waver under an aggressive rebranding tied too closely to," he hesitated, "a personality." "You mean a black personality," Charles said flatly. A murmur. One man choked slightly on his coffee. No, Gerald said too quickly. "I just meant that sudden visibility can complicate investor confidence." Charles leaned forward, folding his hands. "The only thing complicating investor confidence is the idea that a black CEO can't lead without qualification," he said. "You all want the future. You just don't want it to have my face." No one replied. Across the room, one of the younger white analysts, barely 30, tie askew and visibly anxious, glanced up and made the mistake of trying to smooth things over. "I think what Gerald's trying to say is that branding is tricky. We've all got to be careful these days. The public is so sensitive." Charles turned to him slowly. "People weren't sensitive when they were silent while men like me got passed over," he said. "They got sensitive when we stopped asking for permission to exist at the top." The young man looked away. No one laughed this time. No one tried to soften the edges. The room had run out of excuses, and all that was left was the raw material of reality. The meeting continued. By the time Charles walked out, the deal was done. Not because he demanded it, but because they knew he had the leverage to walk away and make the loss visible. Outside, the sun hit the pavement in golden slabs. A reporter waited nearby, angling for a quote, but Charles didn't stop. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because the story wasn't finished. He passed through the lobby like a man made of stone and fire. People watched. Some recognized him. Some didn't. It didn't matter. Back in the car, Charles looked out the window at the city, at a skyline built on deals, on power, on exclusion disguised as neutrality. And he said quietly, almost to himself, "They still think my presence is a disruption. They don't see it's their reflection I'm holding up." And in that truth, Charles smiled, not because the war was over, but because the battle lines had moved. He wasn't walking into their world anymore. They were stepping into his. The press conference wasn't his idea. Charles Emmanuel Wright had long ago learned that real power didn't need podiums. It didn't need to beg for belief. But the board insisted, Visibility was the word they used. Optics. Optics, of course, meaning reassurance. Reassurance to shareholders that their millions were now in the hands of a black man who wouldn't make them uncomfortable. The auditorium filled slowly, a sea of tailored suits and guarded smiles. The lighting was cold, fluorescent, merciless. Charles stood behind the curtain, listening to the rustle of paper, the soft clink of glass, the breathless waiting of people who called themselves allies but flinched at truth. Beside him stood Olivia Marin, the company's new chief of communications, a Latina woman who had fought her own quiet wars up every rung of the corporate ladder. Their eyes met for a moment, no words, just a shared knowing. The announcer's voice rang out, lacquered with false warmth. And now, please welcome our new Executive Director of Acquisitions and Equity Strategy, Mr. Charles E. Wright. The applause was polite, practiced, like a prayer no one meant. Charles walked slowly, not as a man stepping into a role, but as a man refusing to step aside. He adjusted the microphone. The silence that followed wasn't stillness. It was resistance. He let it breathe. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice low and measured. "Let me save us all some time. I'm not here to make you feel good. I'm here to tell you the truth." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not outrage, but discomfort, the kind that clings to skin like heat in a Southern courtroom. "I've heard the talk. That I was a symbolic hire. That I'm a diversity win. That this company needed to shake up its image. And I won't insult your intelligence by pretending that those conversations didn't happen in rooms like this. Behind closed doors. Behind quiet grins." He paused. "I am not here to diversify your optics. I am here to deconstruct your comfort." A hand in the second row clenched around a notepad. Somewhere near the back, a flashbulb popped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. "In the weeks since I've taken this role, I've been tested in ways none of you would ever admit publicly. I've had my seat questioned, my presence dismissed, my credentials doubted, not by those beneath me, but by those sitting beside me." Someone coughed. Another shifted in their chair. Charles continued. "They tell me to be patient. That change takes time. But you know what else takes time? Erosion. And you've been eroding equity for decades, slowly, quietly, politely." He leaned forward slightly. Racism doesn't always wear a hood or carry a torch. Sometimes it wears a smile and holds a clipboard. It speaks in memos. It calls itself tradition. It says we're just looking for the best fit, as if whiteness were a credential. Now the silence felt real. Felt earned. "I'm not here for applause," he said. "I'm not here to be the black man you can point to and say, 'See, we gave him a shot.' I'm here to build what you were too afraid to imagine. A workplace where dignity isn't up for debate. Where equity isn't a department. Where leadership doesn't look like a mirror." He scanned the room slowly, met the eyes of men who had smiled too wide, laughed too loud, and nodded too often without listening. "This isn't your reckoning. It's your reflection." Then, with no theatrics, no applause signaled or earned, he stepped away from the microphone and left the stage. Behind him, the room didn't explode into clapping. It sat, stunned, still, stained with truth. People weren't moved to cheer. They were moved to think. To feel. And that was the point. Outside, as the autumn wind cut through the city's glass spine, Charles looked up at the skyline, not with pride, but with responsibility. He wasn't finished. Because change doesn't arrive with a press release. It arrives in rooms where no one claps. And in men who no longer ask for seats, because they've already built the table.